So, welcome. We are going to talk about Western exceptionalism today and how it impacts what we study and what we learn, and some of the effects on society. So, when I first started the video, I was planning on making a video about the classics and kind of like the common narrative throughout the classics and how it's actually not that diverse. And I ended up falling down the rabbit hole of white supremacy because I started figuring out why these classics were chosen in the first place. And the answer was that it was Western literature. And I was trying to figure out what Western literature was. So I started looking up what Western classics were. And literary critic Harold Bloom made a list of books that could be included in the Western canon. And the overwhelming majority of them are from Europe, with a few ancient books like the Bible or the Mahabharata coming from other nations that were not Europe. Most of the required reading that we have in school adheres to Harold Bloom's list really well. As an example, Columbia's Literature Humanities course, which is included in their core curriculum and every freshman is required to take it. Their list includes authors like Homer, Sappho, Herodotus, Aeschylus, Sophocles, Plato, Virgil, Ovid, Augustine, Dante, Montaigne, Shakespeare, Cervantes, Austen, Dostoevsky, Woolf, and finally Morrison. That list was taken directly from their website, and I included all of the authors on that list, even the ones that I could not pronounce, as you could probably tell. If I need to point it out, that list is very white and very European. Morrison is the only black person on that list, and looking into it, I saw that Columbia's Literature Humanities course is meant to be an intro to Western literature and Western thought. Thinking about it some more, I realized that what was Western overlapped with what was white. So I ended up doing some more research. Let's talk about what Western thought is. Western thought is said to have started with the philosophers of Athens, and expanded to include Christianity by the Roman Empire. I'm going to work my way backwards a bit and start at the current ideal of what Western is, because it is a relatively modern term. I found a definition in Samuel P. Huntington's paper, The Clash of Civilizations, which was published in 1993 and is one of the most cited political science papers. Samuel P. Huntington has been a professor of international relations at Harvard University, and he wrote the paper during the Cold War. He outlines the 7 or 8, his own words, civilizations that inhabited the earth. The "or" is because he did not know whether to include Africa as a civilization. I don't like this guy, as you can probably tell. But as a well-cited expert in the field of political science, his definition of the West is, I guess, an important one that we can. This is the map of civilizations according to him. He has changed a few civilizations since the 1993 paper that I'm referencing. This map is from his later work, which includes an over 300-page book that I did not want to read. The Buddhist and Sinic civilizations have replaced the previous Confucian civilization. I don't have the time to talk about that. Huntington explains in his thesis that the differences between these civilizations are basic. He states, first, differences among civilizations are not only real, they are basic. Civilizations are differentiated from each other by history, language, culture, tradition, and most important, religion. The people of different civilizations have different views on the relations between God and man, the individual and the group, the citizen and the state, as well as differing views of the relative importance of rights and responsibilities, liberty and authority, equality and hierarchy. In this way, he goes on to theorize that civilizations will eventually fight each other because of these base differences, and that these civilizations will clash, and that on the world scale, future wars will be between different civilizations rather than countries. He argues that the differences between these civilizations leads to differences in their cultures that lead them to clash with each other. So he sums up which areas Western civilization includes, which were the Americas, Western Europe, and Australia. He also sums up Western culture really quickly in the essay, saying, Western concepts differ fundamentally from those prevalent in other civilizations.
Western ideas of individualism, liberalism, constitutionalism, human rights, equality, liberty, the rule of law, democracy, free markets, the separation of church and state often have little resonance in Islamic, Confucian, Japanese, Hindu, Buddhist, or Orthodox cultures.
Huntington fails to discuss what liberalism, constitutionalism, and all these other ideals actually mean to him, which makes the paper kind of meaningless, because he attributes these as facets of Western culture, when really, if you have a definition, there's certainly going to be other cultures that include those ideals of liberalism, constitutionalism, human rights, and whatnot. And he fails to mention that if you take like the most popular meaning of some of these terms, for example, liberalism, which boils down to the consent of the governed, he somehow misses out like America colonializing like indigenous people, or America meddling in South American elections and etc. It's just a mess. And I think I know why he didn't define it, because after you define it, then it's hard to argue that the West is the single purveyor of these things, which is part of this problem. He does give us an idea of what the West is, in at least his point of view and the point of view of many political scientists. The ideals of individualism, liberalism, constitutionalism, and like everything else, he said, are not simply products of the West, nor are they exclusive to the West, as he suggests in his paper.
Hey, I'm editing here, and I noticed that I said he suggested it, but he actually explicitly says it when he says modern democratic government originated in the West. When it has developed in non-Western societies, it has usually been the product of Western colonialism or imposition.
Huntington falls victim to the no true Scotsman fallacy, which is where examples that don't fit a generalization are left out so that it appears the evidence supports a claim. Huntington fails to include Western philosophers, such as Hobbes and Aquinas, who don't have Western ideals of human rights, and somehow leaves out that Westerners spread chattel slavery and colonized other countries, but hey, that's okay to him.
Western efforts to propagate such ideas, democracy, human rights, etc., produce instead a reaction against human rights imperialism and a reaffirmation of indigenous values, as can be seen in the support for religious fundamentalism by the younger generation in non-Western cultures.
Human rights and imperialism. Time to discuss. This is not a new idea proposed by Dr. Huntington. Instead, this type of imperialism, human rights imperialism, has been a popular narrative to justify imperialism for many years. And I think one of the biggest examples of this is The White Man's Burden by Rudyard Kipling.
Take up the white man's burden, send forth the best ye breed. Go bind your sons to exile, to serve your captives' need. To wait in heavy harness on fluttered folk and wild, your new caught sullen peoples, half devil and half child.
In this poem, Rudyard Kipling, Jungle Book guy, writes that imperialism is the white man's burden, as in white people need to colonize and imperialize for the good of the people that they are taking over, which I don't think I need to spend too long calling out. This took off as a justification for imperialism.
A noble feat that the white man must complete due to his position of intelligence and culture in the world.
And as white people colonized more, this sentiment was further spread. Imperialism as a positive good became a main part of the narrative. Not only were we taking places over, we were taking them over to teach them about human rights and democracy. Human rights and imperialism are not something that can coexist. Imperialism, by its definition, involves the subjugation of people and the violation of the right to self-governance. Supposedly, that is what imperialist countries are fighting for, according to The White Man's Burden and Clash of Civilizations. Dr. Huntington argues that human rights only appears in non-Western cultures as a result of Western imperialism or colonization.
In the political realm, of course, these differences are most manifest in the efforts of the United States and other Western powers to induce other peoples to adopt Western ideas concerning democracy and human rights. When developed in non-Western societies, democracy and human rights has usually been the product of Western colonialism or imposition.
But as I mentioned before, these Western ideas don't really exist. They've been cherry-picked to say that human rights don't exist in India or democracy doesn't exist in the society of the Iroquois is already an issue because those ideals existed before Westerners appeared. For context, Dr. Huntington's paper was written after the Cold War, and in some part was probably meant to justify America's escapades overseas, meddling in power struggles, and influencing foreign governments. But even with this reason of human rights, America still fought against human rights in Vietnam. Ho Chi Minh wrote a plea including many supposedly Western values, asking for freedom of the press, of political prisoners, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, and so much more. He wished for France to leave so that they could enjoy these human rights. But of course that appeal to France didn't work, and the United States, while pretending not to support France, funded the military occupation of Vietnam. Imperialism as a way to spread human rights doesn't make sense. The idea that we're allowed to subjugate other people because we're better than them, because we have these ideals, isn't new. In fact, it is almost a direct retelling of the white man's burden. Oh fun! It's time to discuss social Darwinism. We need to discuss the underlying hierarchies and supremacy that we are supporting in upholding a Western literary canon. So, if you guys don't know, Darwin came up with the theory of evolution. White supremacists make a sociological concept known as social Darwinism, which was that the fittest of the humans would succeed, and that the unfit would die off. The fittest being like white people, naturally. Social Darwinism draws on the ideas of Malthus, and Malthus said that there wasn't going to be enough food to handle a population one day. And that's why people believed that they needed to compete for these resources, and therefore there were people who would need to be killed off. So following Malthus comes Herbert Spencer, who is a utilitarian. If you guys don't know what utilitarianism is, it's the idea that the action that is morally correct is that which has the result of the greatest happiness for all parties. And he is saying that welfare is bad because it allows the poor and the weak to keep surviving, which is causing a strain on society because they're dragging the rest of the people down, and I don't know, it just messed up. So in his book, which is Social Statics, published in 1850, he argues that welfare programs are morally wrong. And that's an example of social Darwinism and how it was used. Next we have Francis Galton, who is Darwin's half-cousin, who studied the variations in human populations. He wrote an absolutely awful book titled The Inequality of Human Races. I don't recommend you read it. It sucks. I read it and I don't know why. He argues that there are inherent differences in races and that the human race will break down if we start letting the races mingle. So that was straight up white supremacist talk, basically. To argue for this ideology, he said that indigenous people are less intelligent than white people because they have not invented the printer. So I just think someone should tell this guy about the history of the printer. But his argument is one that have been used throughout the ages by colonialists and by Western exceptionalists, because we are supposedly the forward-thinking society. I think it's important to note that the premises that we put up for what is a cultured and progressive and forward-thinking society is already biased by what we see as Westerners. When we look around, we have been conditioned to believe that certain things are intelligent and certain things mean that there is no intelligence. But when you think about it, the Western way of life seems to not value the earth. It seems to be leading us towards a climate crisis, whereas, or at least in America, the indigenous peoples, their way of life is more sustainable for the earth and would probably live longer. That's how they justified a racial hierarchy, by saying that certain people were just not as fit as white people. And that is the Western exceptionalism that's been watered down to affect our current book lists and our current political debates and beliefs and imperialism and like everything that's going on today. The idea of the West is mixed with white supremacy and mixed with an ideology of a race hierarchy that goes against the supposedly Western ideal of equality. So Huntington's thesis reminds me of the white man's burden and social Darwinism, but instead of saying white, he says the West. And he attempts to group these countries together based on supposed ideals, which are just ideals that we're breaking anyway. Common narratives that we read when discussing Western history often overplay democracy. As an example of this is the idea of American democracy being created following the Revolution. I hear a lot that we replace the monarchy with a democracy, but we need to think about what that means. Is it really democratic if the only people that could vote, wealthy landowners, who are white and male? So that's something to think about before you say that democracy was inherently American, because it's not. And democracy is still a work in progress. It wasn't instantly created. It's something that's been evolving over time.
What separates us from the animals, what separates us from the chaos, is our ability to mourn people we've never met.
Following the attacks on the Twin Towers of September 11, 2001, a renewed interest in Samuel P. Huntington's Clash of Civilizations was realized. The latter part of Huntington's thesis includes descriptions of a culture war between the Islamic civilization and the Western civilization. And this is a myth that's propagated even today to account for a ban on Muslims entering the country and a stereotype of Muslims being terrorists, when America is killing many civilians overseas in the same countries that we want to ban Muslims from. This is not to say that 9/11 and several other terrorist attacks on the US are not a tragedy, but we are committing those same tragedies overseas, but we don't care about them because we are not human rights imperialists. There is no way to be a human rights imperialist. President Trump echoed this Western exceptionalism a few days ago when he mentioned that China should not have let the virus enter America and Europe, which draws a dichotomy between the West, America and Europe, and the rest of the world, as he forgot about Australia. Western exceptionalism today may not be as obvious as it has been when we're looking back retrospectively, but it still emerges through racist ideologies and systemic discrimination against those who don't appear Western, especially when those in the United States see Black people as less professional, or refuse to acknowledge AAV, which is African American Vernacular English, as a real dialect, or when we completely ignore the non-West when we're learning history in school. Technically speaking, I'm part of the West, and I have been taught Western exceptionalism for a long time. And several communities today involve Western exceptionalism without even realizing it, and one of those communities are educational institutions. When I look at Columbia's course, Literature and Humanities, that I started off this video with, I see the required reading lists of so many of my classes over the years. I see a common pattern of mostly white authors, which references the ideal that Western literature is somehow better. And you might say that's because I live in a Western country that I get taught Western literature. But a Western country really isn't a thing. There's no real definition of the West. It's a concept made up by people who wanted to seem superior, and therefore ignored the negative parts of their own culture. Western exceptionalism attempts to twist historical Western culture to fit our modern beliefs and values. It's time we reevaluated what literature we teach. Classics are supposed to be about a universal human experience, but there's only one experience that is consistently revisited in my reading lists, and that is the white experience. We should also begin including other cultures, because when we begin to understand each other, those cultural fault lines that Samuel P. Huntington talks about in his Clash of Civilizations, they cease to exist. It's important to get a diverse perspective on all of these things and not only learn the Western history that we've been taught.